Gagne, and they treated us to lunch at their little place where they lived. And three of the four of us, let's just say, had some real digestive problems immediately afterwards.
Really?
For the rest of the week, except Lori, who ate like a bird. In this case, was probably a good thing. It was so it was kind of so we'll
I thought you were buying lunch today.
Here? Oh, here?
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
So that was funny that Jennifer goes, well, don't tell people that Gagne made you sick.
Yeah.
Anything like that.
If my wife were here, she would make sure that my tie was straight, collar was straight, hair is not shining in the. Okay.
I think you look fine. It's a dandy scarf and neck. I guess it's a handkerchief.
Yeah.
Coat pockets. So I think you're
All right.
there.
All right.
How's our sound doing?
Yeah, we're rolling. We have to start off with a few jokes now. You got any good ones? I can show them back at all.
Well, they can't be official jokes, like the new computer virus that's going around called Viagra.
Viagra.
Turns your 3 1/4-inch drive into a hard drive.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Well, Dr. Kaufman, I'm delighted that you're willing to participate in such a project like this. I think about my days at the University of Oklahoma, where all we did was the people we sat in class with were people who read about you and some of the colleagues here. And for those students and for those across the country and for those 20 years from now, this is for them and to help them see who you are and hear a little bit about your life and story. So
Happy to be here in spite of your having to have read my stuff. I hope it wasn't too punishing. It was from students and colleagues that I got ideas on how to continuously improve. And that's sort of practicing our craft in a way, isn't it? Formative evaluation, continuous improvement, using data for fixing and not for blaming is one of our hallmarks. So thank you for inviting me to be here.
tell us a little bit about your journey, where you started and how you got to where you are today.
Well, how far back? I started life at a very early age, being born and brought up in Washington, D.C. And it was somewhere along the journey. I remember sitting out in my back porch, and everybody was pushing on me. Well, Roger, what do you want to be when you grow up? You got to make these decisions. In junior high school, I make those decisions. I was interested in playing baseball, and occasionally girls. And so I remember sitting on the back porch and saying, well, I'm basically a nosy person, and I like knowing why people do things. I think I'll major in psychology. And so I did major undergraduate in psychology and got interested not in clinical as much as industrial and organizational psychology. Went on and got a master's degree at Johns Hopkins, took a short excursion to finish all my doctoral requirements, but not my degree at Berkeley. And on the way, went to work for Boeing Airplane Company, Martin, Baltimore, making airplanes. Starting to worry about why people didn't perform and what were the implications of not performing. Ended up finishing my doctorate at New York University and went to work at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, who then were very much into teaching machines and programmed instruction. And that fit very well with my training and education in industrial and experimental psychology. And along the way, I remember sitting in a class at New York University. Irene Cipher was my major professor. And that was before the time it was fashionable to have females as major professors or full professors or faculty. And got a lot of guidance from her, as I have in life. I've had some really good mentors. I remember her talking about this strange guy by the name of Bob Major. Later I found out it was Bob Mager, when he told me so, who was writing ditto master things on behavioral objectives. And I remember thinking, isn't that silly to set specifications? I was very well brainwashed by my educational establishment, which says, the joy of learning and the freedom. And first rejecting the ideas, and then sitting back and thinking that doesn't it make some sense to say where you're headed and how to tell when you've arrived? And it was from that base that I started pushing the question, well, where do the objectives come from? And it occurred to me that, what you do is you look at the subject matter, and there's where the objectives, what should people know? Now, that doesn't make any sense because that captured yesterday. It didn't capture tomorrow. And so I kept asking these questions that took me from the emphasis then on how to teach to what to teach, which are the objectives and behavior, to why teach what you teach, and that is what accomplishments are important. Then it occurred to me, well, there's accomplishments beyond schooling, isn't there, or beyond training programs. What should that eventuate in? So I started working with the idea that the primary client and beneficiary of everything, any individual, any group, any organization is society now in the future. And so that brings me to where I am today, where I think all planning, management, implementation, evaluation, continuous improvement ought to have its primary focus. Tomorrow's child, society will go to what I call the mega level. That's a little distorted, isn't it?
Yeah.
There were some other things along the way.
You've got your, you have 2 doctorates, is that correct?
Oh, no, I barely got one, no.
Oh.
No, I finished all my doctoral work at Berkeley, but never finished a dissertation. Went on to work for Boeing. At that time, I had a family to support, and from there, that took me to Martin, Baltimore, where I really got into training. At Boeing, I was a one-man human factors group. And of course, human factors includes human performance. And then I went to work with some really outstanding people, top-notch people in the field at Martin, Baltimore, the Martin Company. Now that's Martin Marriott, and by the time people view this, it might be merged with AT&T or something, who knows. And got to work with people like Fred Muckler and Scott Hassler and Doug Nicholas, who really started teaching me about how to merge the literature and the research with operational realities. And so, no, just one PhD, finally, at New York University in communications.
You mentioned earlier that there have been a number of people who served as mentors to you. Tell us a little bit about your mentors.
Probably the earliest one that I didn't realize was my father. My father was a mathematical physicist out of MIT and was probably one of the first people in distance learning. He set up what now is the National Radio Institute's correspondence program with mentoring and feedback and actual activities back right before I was born. But he was a guy that I couldn't talk to until I finished graduate school because I didn't have the right wavelength. I was interested in people and he was interested in things. And probably the most important thing he said to me, well, it sticks with me now, is he said, "Roger, life is like a course in calculus." And I said to myself, what kind of nonsense is this? Then he said, the first course that everybody takes and masters is differentiation. The second course that most people don't get to, and even if they do, they don't apply, is integration. And so the idea of system and wholes rather than splinters and parts is some really good mentoring I got from him. Another guy is that I learned an awful lot from is a fellow by the name of Joe Tucker. Joe ended up at one time being head of the instructional technology program at Catholic University. But Joe mentored me through my doctorate. He's the one who helped me define a research topic and got me to think about some of the research questions of the day. And what I did is I looked at the amount of remedial feedback that's required in a branching type program for mastery, and found out that Sidney Pressey, in fact, was right, that all you have to do is tell people whether it's right or wrong. The rest is, according to my research and then others that didn't believe it but followed it up and found that the same thing, and that is that basically people just want to know whether they're right or wrong. Along the way, other mentors, Harold Greenwald. Harold Greenwald is one of the 2 world's great psychotherapists. In his book, Direct Decision Therapy, he and I and Albert Ellis, another psychotherapist, used to teach a course together at U.S. International University in San Diego on psychotherapy and planning. And I learned from Harold about the importance of decision making and that decisions are on the basis of payoffs you're getting now and payoffs you want to get. And if you don't see any payoffs in changing your behavior, you won't get any changes at all. Another person was Ted Blau. Ted is a past president of the American Psychological Association, another psychotherapist who taught me a lot about human behavior and the importance of individual differences and how you calibrate those, and how important it is that you design learning opportunities and performance opportunities on the basis of what people bring to the table and where they're headed. Other mentors in my life, strange enough, my wife Jan. She's a professional puppeteer and comes at things really from a different point of view. But what she got me to see is alternative ways of letting people express themselves and getting to people, especially on the word need, which I only think should be used as a noun, not a verb as a verb sense. And now Jan has a little rod puppet, N-E-E-D, and need comes and talks to the audience about how she's getting so tired and exhausted because people use her as a noun and a verb and she doesn't know where she's coming or going. So the importance of our field as a performing art, and what we do in communicating as performing art, a lot I got from her. There's some other people who are important, even though they weren't direct influences. Bob Gagne, of course, his writings were the first that went from behaviorism to cognitive psychology and showed hierarchies of learning that really made some sense. His research was an inspiration and a guide to what I call micro-level design, development, implementation, evaluation. Bob Morgan was working at the time I was coming up in the field at then the U.S. Office of Education. He headed up a huge project, the first demonstration project of performance, what we call now performance technology, to in school year ES 70, Educational System 70. They actually applying the models and tools. Bob Branson, who was working on what is now the basic instructional system development model that became the joint services model. At that time he was looking at things like vital signs to determine whether something was working or not. Yeah, there's been a lot of people in my life who have helped guide me who would reject any kind of association or credit for that.
Tell us how you came about to come to Florida State. I believe you were in California at the time?
Yes, I was at U.S. International University, which was probably the last great experiment in a university that was learner-centered. One day I got a call from Bob Morgan. He said, "Well, why don't you come on out and you know, give a seminar, a colloquium." And so I came out. As I recall, flew the red eye. Bob, as he wanted to do, I think scheduled something at 3 o'clock in the morning here in town at where his office was, and gave a colloquium. And at that time, I thought, and I was very much out of the mainstream. Already then, I was talking about the importance of referring everything to external value added. Didn't use those terms at the time. Gave the presentation and walked around and met some people at that time with the Center for Educational Technology. And later on that day, he said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Think about what?" He said, "Well, about joining us, joining the faculty here." And I was a little bit surprised because I didn't know that was the real agenda. I knew that Florida State at the time was the premier organization, as I think it is today, in performance improvement, at least the scientific side of it. And I was enormously flattered. Got back to the hotel, called my wife, and said, "Wow, what do you think about moving to Tallahassee?" We were living in San Diego at the time. And she said, "What, move to the armpit of Florida?" She's a native Floridian. And I said, "What?" She said, "Nobody wants to live up there. That's where the Ku Klux Klan is." And I said, "Jan, have you ever been to Tallahassee?" "Nope, but I don't have to." Well, turns we flew back, and I started talking about the opportunities to work with the top people in the field and continue my mentoring and learning, and maybe work with some bright graduate students along the way. And finally, she came out one time, looked at the place over and said, "This is really nice." And so we moved. That was about 22 and a half years ago. Originally, we thought, well, we'd try it out for a year, year and a half at the most, and we're still here. I guess they can't get rid of me.
You've written over 30 books and over 160 journal articles. So
Can't get it right, can I?
I would say that you would be an expert. Tell us about the process that you use for research and for writing articles and books.
The process for research. Probably the best research base that I get is interaction with graduate students and other faculty members, talking about ideas, who's saying what, and what justification do they have for it. Students are very much immersed in the literature. Sometimes it's fun to get them to branch out and find out that not everything is written by the contemporary people in the field. They ought to go back in the history of psychology and sociology and statistics. And, so the basis for the library research is actually getting into it and reading what other people are writing. Part of the fun things is writing book reviews. Sometimes I'm invited to review a book either for a publisher or for a journal, a professional publication. It gives you a chance to read and critique. Another rich source is doing journal reviews, being a review editor. For a while I was a journal editor myself and got to see a broad range. So that tells you a lot about what's going on in the field. Actually forming the ideas for what to write about, oh, that's wonderful. Because if you keep asking the question why, it leads you into some very, very interesting questions, and thus into some interesting research. I noted earlier that I kept asking questions of why and so what. And if you push on that long enough, it really enlarges the envelope. It really makes you think the trite phrase out of the box, but it does. And asking questions such as, well, if distance learning is the solution, what's the problem? Or if Florida State University is the solution, what's the problem? And my work with large organizations such as the Australian Department of Defense, Millikan, March of Dimes, it's a question that I ask them to answer with me. If your organization is the solution, what's the problem? And that really brings up a lot of ideas about the relationship between means and ends and relating internal results to external payoffs and consequences. So that's what the 33 books have been building up to. The most recent one is I'm clear about my definition of mega and the relationship to macro and micro. Mega is where the primary client and beneficiary of any organization is society now and the future. Macro is the primary client is the organization itself, and micro are the building block results that most people in instructional technology and human resources, human performance focus on. But it really doesn't make any sense to stop here at the micro level unless it adds value at the macro level. And it really doesn't make any sense to stop at the macro level unless you're adding value to your external clients in society. And so that's a lot of rich topics for research and development. For instance, what are the characteristics of people are there any personality characteristics that have people either accept or reject or be open to the concept of an ideal vision? A statement in measurable terms of what kind of world do we want to help create for tomorrow's child. There's some people who are just plain reactive. I don't want to deal with that. That's not my job. I can't control all of it. So they don't. They go down, they regress, and go back down, ideally to process so they can look at alternate ways of delivering content. It's very interesting whether people are open to it or not. And thus, for instance, you get into the change literature. One of the things I want to pursue now is change management is all the rage. But I think that's only part of the story. I think another part of the story, which might even be more important, is change creation. Not just reacting to change, but creating the kind of environment and world that you want.
Going back to your the articles and the books that you've written, what mechanically do you tell us about? Do you find that you write best in the morning? How do you get the the energy to just sit down and write. That seems to be a stumbling block for so many people.
Well, one of it is ego. Being egotistical enough to think that you have something useful to say. The other thing is that I've got a great partner in life. I don't have to worry about mowing the lawn or cleaning the windows, or we have a good partnership. And when I'm writing or working, when she can't stand anymore, Jan comes in with a sign that says attention, and I know I've spent too much time away. So most important thing is have a great partner in life. When do I write? Much to everybody's consternation, early in the morning, where everybody else is trying to drive to office and to work. I get on the computer, sometimes early as 6 o'clock. And if it flows, fine. If it doesn't, I shut it down or play a game or read something and go on. Doesn't make any difference the time of day. Sometimes I'll come back from work and have some interesting discussions, or have read something that I find useful, and I'll start writing 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. But one of the things I don't do is I don't write when it's not flowing. And I also learned that never send out the first draft of what you read. That probably doesn't answer your question, does it?
No, it does. What have you learned about writing from your experiences being an editor?
Again, a couple of my mentors. There was a fellow by the name of Bunny Smith, B. Othanel Smith, at University of Illinois. To me, probably the greatest expert on educational curriculum. And he was a mentor to me. One day he caught me at a panel meeting, U.S. Department of Education, and he recommended I write a book to somebody he consulted with, and I said, "Oh, come on." He said, "Roger, if I wrote like you, I do nothing else." And I said, "Oh, come on, Bunny." He and Harold Greenwald said, "For God's sake, Roger, write like you talk. Don't get all hung up in formal words and phrases. Don't get all convoluted. Pretend you're at the keyboard and that you're talking to somebody." And that helps a lot. I still have to overcome a lot of the old tendencies to never use I and things like that. But try to make it conversational, and worry a lot about the person who's reading it and whether they can understand it. And indeed, instructional system designers tell us that, don't they? People like John Keller with his ARCS model talk about motivation. And these kinds of things really help. Think about the reader. Think of it as a communication device, the purpose of which is to either change somebody's behavior and performance or maintain it. And have something in mind, the reader, and what you want her or him to do with it as a result.
I've noticed that you do probably the best job of anybody that I've seen of mentoring your graduate students.
God, there'll be some people that argue with you about that.
Tell me about, talk to us a little bit about the role of a graduate student as a faculty member, and your responsibility, and how you can really, that relationship.
Well, we're lucky because by the time they get to us, they're very well screened. They're self-selected. They usually know what they want to do. They have motivation. They have drive. And for me, the first thing to do is separate out the ones who just want to get their tickets punched on the way, or those who really want to learn something and contribute. I find that those who just want to get the little stamps put on their book as they progress through, I usually don't think that I have much to contribute to them. On the other hand, those people who really want to learn something and push me and push the field and want to contribute to new knowledge, I mean, that's a gold mine. And then what you do is listen to them in terms of what it is they want to accomplish. Ask them to, I almost always ask them when they're thinking about research, is to write down the questions you want to get answers to. Actually, it's a research point of view. It's a research attitude. And from there, try to get them to see where the literature is, get in there, find out what we know. We actually use some basics of inquiry. Work with them to maybe the basic questions of as I said, what do you want answers to? Why this problem versus all other problems? You have to winnow it down. And so that's really a needs assessment question, isn't it? What are the gaps between current knowledge and results and desired knowledge and results? And why do you want to work on this? What's the prioritization? What do you give and what do you get for answering this question? And then the next question is why this solution versus all other solutions? What are the alternative ways and means to close those gaps? And the third question is how do you know when you've accomplished what you set out to accomplish? And that's the evaluation continuous improvement question. And learners here are absolutely great about that. Then there's another classification, subclassification of those, and those are those that choose to participate in our research and development. And then you get more time to spend with them and actually get to spend some time with them as they develop projects. They work with external clients and show them how you actually apply this stuff in an operational setting. And I've been blessed with some great graduate students in that kind of arena.
A lot of your, I noticed that a lot of your graduate students will work with you on projects. And for some people, that's very threatening. A lot of folks will not be as willing to let graduate students be involved as deeply as you let your graduate students do. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think one of our charges is to help them become contributing professionals. And part of that is doing research, doing the publication. If a graduate student comes up with an initial idea and conceptualizes it, they're the senior author. And right now, I've in the last few years, I've been ending up being last author on a lot of articles, and that's part of the process of mentoring, helping them build their reputations, deserved reputations. I don't see anything to be threatened about that. You say my publication list is probably enough to get me a job as an untenured assistant professor someplace else. I think it's one of the responsibilities and fun is sharing professional development with those people who you think can make a contribution in the future. I really don't see why anybody would be threatened by a graduate student. I think it's a great opportunity to renew oneself.
What advice would you give to those graduate students who are looking into coming into the program and they want to do it right? They're getting ready to start out and they don't want to make the mistakes and they're just looking for some advice. What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn. That's the concept of continuous improvement, is that you learn from the mistakes and revise as required. Somebody coming into the program or coming into the field, or both? Beware of the conventional wisdom. Get out of your comfort zones. Tomorrow is not a linear projection of yesterday and today. It goes in step functions. Things are dramatically different now than they were 5 years ago. Realize that the same paradigms and tools that got them to be successful and others successful will get them into trouble in the future. For instance, we used to think that it's really important to do systems analysis as the first thing, or front-end analysis at the front end. And then if you do that, you're just perpetuating the status quo. Because analysis is what? Breaking things down to individual component parts and finding out how they work independently and together. But it doesn't answer the question of what should you analyze. That's the assessment question. So don't start with analysis, start with assessment. Look at the future. As Peter Drucker says, if you can't predict the future, create it. Don't be afraid to deviate from the conventional wisdom of the day. Build a new reality, not just try to polish up the old one. Again, a trite Druckerism is we're getting better and better at doing that which should not be done at all. So that's why I would encourage them to look at boundaries beyond individual human performance improvement, to look at organizational improvement and societal improvement. Don't be afraid of topics outside of our field. There's a tendency for people to only want to take the courses in our program or department. There's brilliant people all over this university and other university. Go and learn what their take is on life. Learn how economists think, and how sociologists think, and how engineers think, and then integrate, pick from those skills and tools and concepts and ideas that we can use to build together a better tomorrow. So don't be splintered, don't be doctrinaire, and above all, don't be scared.
How, as professionals, what can we do to improve education?
Do of all that we know how to do. A book I just reviewed, which I think is going to be a classic, Joe Harless's Eden Conspiracy, is probably a good way to think about it. I agree with Joe when he says, stop thinking about the course and stop thinking about subject matter. All we do in education, by and large, is focus on the course content. And we don't ask the question of what content should it be? What should people learn and why? We don't focus and teach kids, learners, how to integrate across the knowledge areas. We don't teach them how to identify alternative futures. So we don't practice what we know how to do in performance improvement. We start with analysis and subject matter experts, maybe better called subjective matter experts. Instead of looking at building successful citizens, we look at building people who know content. So I think we've got education backwards. I think that we are looking at what I call input, process, and product, the building blocks, the core content, the individual learning skills, without first looking at what kind of skills, knowledge, attitudes, and abilities will people have to create a better world for themselves and everyone else, and use what Harless calls the accomplished citizen. People are not under the care, custody, or control of another person, agency, or substance. People are good neighbors, and we can measure that, and then roll that down to find out what are those skills, what are those objectives and criteria should the educational organization commit to deliver and move ever closer to them. That becomes the mission objective. Mission objective now is, well, let's take most universities, excellence in teaching, research, and service. Well, I don't know what the hell that means. Neither does anybody else. You know, I've never met an excellence, and I defy anybody else to say that they have in the last year. And we use these loose words to make us feel comfortable so we can say, well, let's keep on doing what we're already doing. So let's derive our mission objectives on the basis of what value are we going to add to society and external clients. And then roll down from there to find out what skills, knowledge, and attitudes the learners have to perform in school, graduate and complete and be certified, and then be continuously improving adults. And we do, instead of that rolling down, the cascading down, with society as the primary client and beneficiary, we roll up from resources to activities to test scores, and then a graduation, then hope it's going to be successful. And I think the data are pretty clear that although the United States spends the second highest per student in the world, our results and consequences are pretty expensive for what we get back. It's not great. And still we have lots of disenfranchised, unlucky, and unfortunate people who are perhaps even getting further and further away from the self-sufficiency. So we probably have ample data to know that whatever we're doing now, just putting more time or money into it is not going to make things better. In fact, it might make things worse. We have this very interesting habit of public schools that they really mess up big time. We put more money into them. Why? Well, we don't want to hurt the kids. And so what we're doing is we're reinforcing the negative things that they do to kids to get non-performance. So again, let's talk about performance, accomplishment, and contribution, and use that as the driver rather than knowledge and activity.
In our field, you've watched it grow and change over the last number of years. So, how would you define instructional systems and talk about how our field is moved into a field embracing performance?
That's an interesting one. I was a founder of then the National Society for Programmed Instruction, which then became the National Society for Performance Improvement, and now the International Society for Performance Improvement. And I guess was lucky enough to be elected president of that organization and some other things. We started off with how. How do you design and deliver learning? Programmed instruction was the first formulation of that, which was to be self-paced, written against performance objectives. Actually, we called them behavioral objectives at that time. And that got to be all the rage. Of course, there were some people who hated it and thought it was dehumanizing. But again, the whole idea of basing instruction and learning on the basis of scientific principles, scientific research, was very appealing. And as I said earlier, people like Gagne and others actually led the field in terms of showing the scientific base for learning hierarchies. Benjamin Bloom was others, and then we had people get into the affective domain. So that was the emphasis for a long, long time. And the big argument then was whether you would do linear programming, which was based upon Skinner's work, or whether you're going to do intrinsic or branching program based upon Norman Crowder's work. And we had great big arguments about whether programmed instruction was spelled with one M or two M's. And people like Susan Meyer Markle really made a contribution to how people learn and the concepts. And pretty soon we found out that linear programming and branching programming were really coming together. Of course, that left two warring camps without anybody to pick on. And then we started asking broader and broader questions, like where do the objectives come from? And so that's when people got into things like front-end analysis and task analysis, and then learning task analysis, and the differences between those. And then we found out, gee, we could design learning experiences for people that actually ended up in mastery. And but some people didn't like to do that. Didn't fit with their paradigm or how we ought to do it. But again, the field kept on asking itself questions. And people were doing training. And some people said, well, training is just one method, just one means of providing learning opportunities. Are there any other ways? And then from human engineering and other areas, we find out, well, we could do job redesign. We could do job aids. In fact, of some of Harless's earlier work, Allison Rossett's more recent work has been on job aids, guiding people through. And that's today's expressed on computers as what? Human performance systems. And then we started asking even more questions. Well, where do the objectives come from? We do needs assessment. And the first thing people want to do is run off and get in their old comfort zones and say, well, let's ask them what they need. And so that kept that solutions orientation, that need as a verb, instead of saying, well, what are the discrepancies between current performance and desired performance? And to find that gap in results as a need, and then place those in priority order. And so some people started looking at the difference between needs assessment and quote, training needs assessment, which tended to dump you right back into a training or intervention solution and foreclose your option. And then we started asking even broader questions that Tom Gilbert, who probably wrote the definitive academic guide on performance engineering, pointed out something that we're even missing today, and that is the difference between behavior and performance. We still tend to focus on behavior, and that is what people do. And he said, that's just a means. Behavior will lead you to accomplishment or non-accomplishment. And he points out that, for instance, you give just about any teenager and adult a bow and arrow and a target, and they'll do 99% of all the behaviors required of an expert marksman. but they miss that one thing which ends up in the marks and performance. So performance is the accomplishment. That's what's left at the end of the day. Behavior is how you get there. And so more and more we started to see that it was performance that was important, not behavior or activities. And so that, I think, gave rise to what we now call human performance technology now, which I think is an awful term. I don't know why technology. It sounds like it's things and not people. So if anybody out there wants to be memorialized forever, come up with a different name for that, another name for distance learning. To describe, it's the impact and consequences that's important, not the means. And we kept on asking these questions. I remember my first excursion into saying the primary client and beneficiary of anything that we use, do, produce, and deliver is society. And I got a lot of heat back in 67, 68, 69. You know, that was just airy-fairy nonsense. Wasn't real world. No, I still get that from some of our graduate students who just want to go out and learn how to do a better computer program or something. And now I don't feel so lonely in that as we've expanded the envelope. Faith Popcorn in the Popcorn Report in 1990 talked about that doing societal good is no longer a corporate option. It's a must. Peter Drucker started talking about societal implications. And I didn't feel as lonely anymore in talking about the primary client and beneficiary of everything we use, do, produce, and deliver as being society. So we've been expanding the envelope because, after all, the tools and techniques and concepts we use are generalizable to any level. And if we decide to stay down in the weeds and just look at inputs, processes, and products without measurably linking them to value added for the organization, external clients, and society, then we take the risks of being a solution to no known problem.
Our schools of instructional systems have traditionally been in colleges of education. But now that we're evolving and we're moving into performance, some argue that maybe our schools are misplaced. Maybe we need to be in colleges of business, colleges of information, other areas. Talk about your thoughts on that and the struggle that's going on.
Well, probably the reason why most of them are in colleges of education is because of the education and training link. Part of our pioneers, people like Don Ely and others, came out of the media field to improve instruction, and that was a college of education kind of activity. Then we got into multimedia. People like Jim Russell, who both of these people serve in our continuing faculty here, were the pioneers in this delivery mechanism. So it's very comfortable to support schools and media and instructional support centers. And so from there, people like Jim Finn at University of Southern California, where I taught for a while, started asking questions. Well, if media is the solution, what's the problem? And it got into teaching about individual performance improvement in instructional systems and these kinds of things. So I think it came out of that educators and education was a primary vehicle. Everybody's always interested in improving the schools, and there it was. There was the vehicle. But I think your observation is correct that the world is not divided into disciplines. Reality is not divided into disciplines. Yet we teach it that way. And what you're pointing out is that it's the integrations that are important. Like my father told me that the second course in calculus is about integration. Right now, I'm a research professor of engineering management at Old Dominion University. Before that, at New Jersey Institute of Technology is another area in which I work with other disciplines. Before that, with industrial engineering at University of Central Florida. So engineering sees this as a natural thing for their people to have. It could certainly be in a school of business. I've written several articles with Melvin Stith, who's dean of the School of Business here. And we see these cross ties that are there. I think one of the disadvantaged universities, especially public ones, is that we are enrollment driven. We're full-time equivalent driven. And so what happens is that if I send somebody over to Doug Zahn in statistics to learn about statistics and continuous improvement. They get the credit for it. They get the money. We don't. And I think this is a silly word. It's funding education on the basis of means and not on ends and payoffs. I think that we are going to find more and more exactly what you're saying. We're going to find out the various disciplines are merging and blurring, and we're going to find out that it's about building the successful citizen and professional, not about course content. As we get from means to micro ends to macro ends to mega ends, we'll start seeing the integration. I think that'll happen.
For a number of years, business and industry has gobbled up our graduates out of our program, and yet education has not given us not hired any of our graduates. Why do you think that is?
Well, they have hired our graduates. Some of them have become academics. People like Jim Klein, who worked with me in the Center for Needs Assessment and Planning, got his doctorate with us, is now a full professor at Arizona State University. We have people at the University of Texas system. So they do hire some of our people. I think if you're talking about public education, I think one reason is because they don't offer enough money. Where's the incentive when you can go to work for an Arthur Andersen or for a Motorola or an IBM and make $35,000 to $50,000 a year? What's the incentive for going to work at $23,000 a year? The other thing is that I think business and industry sees a much more immediate tie between competence and contribution and what drives their business. So they tended to hire those people who can put competencies to work right away. Now, whether they do or not is another situation. I find a lot of our students get in and are asked to do some of the most inane things, process-oriented, busy work. And one of the things we probably should provide our students with the skills is how to do conflict resolution and teach your boss what are the questions to ask and answer without threatening them. But I think there's more immediate gratification for the students where A, they're wanted, and B, whether they get some sort of decent remuneration. I would love to change that. I would love to see schools get more results-oriented, results accountability, instead of process-driven and compliance-driven. And I think we'll get to that.
What excites you about our field?
What we can do to add value to society. I think that we are the keepers of principal set of keys about performance and performance improvement. And that rather than being ideology-driven, we are performance and value-added driven. And I think we know how to do it. I think we know how to learn and continuously improve. And I think we can add value to any organization, as you say, whether it's public or private, education, health services, or computer manufacturers. I think the skills, knowledge, attitudes, tools, and abilities that our field has to offer are A, expanding, and B, we can make very, very noticeable contributions to any organization. I find that exciting.
Tell us, you've been in the field a number of years. And you've seen,
Too many, maybe.
You've seen a number of people and you've experienced things. Surely you have some favorite stories of yours pertaining to our field.
No, I don't want you to have to censor this. This was a lively bunch of people way back when, so some of these stories are probably inappropriate. I do remember Joe Tucker talking to the National Education Association when we were working together at U.S. Industries. And he got into this argument with a polemicist who maybe the equivalent of our modern-day constructivist or critical theorist who felt that, all you have to have is a good teacher, that none of this performance technology and performance improvement stuff was any good. In fact, it was dehumanizing, that all you have to do is have a good teacher. And Joe said, well, how do you know a good teacher? Well, it's something that you can't measure. And then Joe said in front of literally 1,500, 2,000 people, well, if you can't tell the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher, how can you tell the difference between a teacher and a non-teacher? And what he did is he set up the whole case for performance, because unless you measure, try to obtain performance, you don't know how to get from here to there. You don't know how to evaluate whether you've gotten there or not. You don't know how to continuously improve and what to keep and what to throw away. Another time I recall is that one of the professional societies, we decided to have lessons learned and have people who are very, very well known in the field talk about their great failures, because we can learn from the great failures. If you read the journals, you never have the journal of failed ideas. All you hear is about the good stuff, and you never hear about what didn't work, which is just as important. Negative instances are just important, sometimes more important. We got together some outstanding people. I remember Bob Morgan was on that panel, and indeed other people. And folk came away saying that was one of the most important things that ever happened to them. And of course, it was never repeated again.
Rumor has it in your classes that you charge students a quarter when they misuse the word need.
I plead guilty to that.
You've
I don't charge it, they charge themselves.
You obviously feel strongly about that. You've mentioned this a couple of times today so far, but why is that so important?
Well, one of the things that I've come up with, for now anyway, are 6 critical success factors for being a professional. This relates to 2 of those, maybe 3 of those 6 critical success factors. The second critical success factor is don't confuse means and ends. Don't confuse how with what. And that gets to what? Performance instead of activities. So I think it's very, very important in our field that we first decide where you're headed, why you want to go there, and how to tell when you've arrived before you select how to get there. The second, another critical success factor is need is a noun. It's only a gap between current and desired results, not a gap in inputs or processes or how to do it. If you define need as a gap in results, it opens up all kinds of vistas to you, which otherwise you close down. Because if you have what is for results and what should and could be for results, you have a gap in results. And you get a triple bonus for that. The what should be gives you your design specifications, your objectives. Okay? So you don't have to have a separate development plan and objective. Second, it gives you your evaluation and continuous improvement criteria. You don't have to go ahead and develop another evaluation plan. There it is, based upon the gap between current results and required results. And the third thing it gives you is a way to never get a proposal turned down again as long as you live. Because if you make a proposal to people on the basis of the cost to meet the need versus the cost to ignore it, then you have a very, very different equation than we usually have. Most proposals, either internal or external, get turned down because people say, well, that costs too much money. Okay? But if you say, now, what does it cost not to meet that need, which we almost never talk about, then if they turn you down, they become responsible for not meeting the need or closing the gap in performance and results and consequences. So when you talk about need as a verb, need to, need for, needing, needed, you're not talking about a gap in results. You're talking about a gap in process. We need more time, we need more teachers, we need less teachers. That's about means and not about ends. And if you pick a solution before you know the problem, the probability of success are pretty low. But it does keep you in your comfort zone. Well, we need more money for this project. And you ask people, well, suppose the budget was $1 gazillion. Let's take that away. Now, what do you got? So people throw up obstacles, psychological, usually without knowing it, by having a means orientation instead of an ends orientation. So one of the things, we used to only charge a dime. I guess it's inflation, and probably future generations will be up to $100, who knows. And what the students do is every time somebody uses need as a verb or in a verb sense, they flip a quarter into a kitty. And at the end of the semester or the course, we go out and have a hell of a party. And if they're not around, for instance, the last few years, we've been giving that money to the battered women's shelter. It's just an idea, way to get people to focus on the difference between ends and means, and that needs are not the same as wants.
Take a break for just a minute.
Okay.
Great. I'm offline, and it's
Yeah.
always, it's talking about people, just,
Yeah.
it's just interesting when you think about that, because you.
See, a lot of us know too much about each other,
Well.
and if we tell, they'll tell.
Well, and I guess the risk is they can, even though they may have already done the tape before, they can always come back and, well, let's do another reshoot. Yeah, that could be fun, I guess, but maybe.
It's hard to recall a videotape.
Yeah, but you can get the last word. You're on the last one.
Yeah. But I have not previewed anybody else's.
All right, I've got some good ones. Now, I'm gonna, before we start, are we rolling?
Oh, we're rolling. We have like 3 hours to take, so don't worry about it.
Do you want to close the door?
Yeah.
One thing that,
We don't want anybody intelligent wandering in here.
Yeah.
one of the things that, one of my goals, one of my outcomes is for the people to get to know you better.
Why are you being so mean-spirited?
Yeah. And so, I mean, this is, obviously I'm gonna edit this, but this is just, and I don't know quite how to do that. Or thought on your graduate work and your work. I mean, you've moved to a couple of different places to do doctoral work,
Mhm.
and there's a question in there, and it's like a detective.
Well, why don't you ask?
So anyway, that's you've got an idea, and I'm struggling on formulating the right question for you. So we'll just, since you know an idea, now I'll ask you a question, you have some idea. Tell us a little bit more about your graduate experience, what it was like, and maybe some lessons that you've learned that future graduate students can.
Well, I guess in my case, and everybody's probably different, mine was a matter of growing up enough, maturing enough to take real advantage of the resources that I had. As I look back, I had a wonderful set of faculty at Johns Hopkins University, and I just learned a lot. I wasn't mature enough to take advantage of probably some of the greats in learning theory, like Jim Deese and methodology, like Tex Garner, industrial psychology with Al Chapanis. These are names that are historic in psychology, but nobody ever knows about them anymore. I learned a lot, but it was mostly latent learning. And then I decided, well, I better go to Berkeley, go to a bigger school, and I was flattered they'd accept me and give me a scholarship. And again, I was with some of the great people, Ed Gazelli, Brown, Gazelli and Brown is a famous book then in industrial psychology. Great things in personality assessment. And again, I didn't have the maturity probably to take full advantages of it at that time. And then I was dumb enough to start having a family and another life and putting pressures on myself. But I was learning along the way, running into some really bright students, having the advantage of publishing my first article in the Valhalla of psychological journals, the Journal of Experimental Psychology with Jim Deese. That was my first article. I mean, that's not a bad place to start. And at Berkeley with Gazelli and Lyman Porter, who's now a distinguished professor at UC Irvine on some research that we were doing. So it was a good experience for me to learn from people who were outstanding at the field on what it takes to make a contribution to the field. Not only do you study, but you try to refresh and even build the knowledge base. But then I was having to grow up and learn how to take a real advantage of it. Then I went off to Boeing and was a one-man human factors group on on the Beaumark missile. And it's kind of interesting that to be one person on one of the Air Force's largest projects. And boy, that was on the job training, I'll tell you. And got some mentoring from another larger human factors group who always wanted to close this down because they wanted to be the only human factors group, but at the same time learning from some outstanding people. From there, back to Martin Baltimore, which I described earlier. And again, learning some more along the way. And what I tried to do, I learned from the early days, is to, if we found out something that was worth sharing, to write. And that's why probably I've written too much, but there's some neat things that I learned along the way that others had helped teach me. Then I decided that I wanted to be in the performance improvement business, so I went to work with U.S. Industries. And in fact, Tom Erline, who was my boss at Martin Baltimore, was over reading a newspaper one Sunday, and he says, "What's this program instruction stuff?" And he said, "It's a blind ad." And I said, "Oh, that's U.S. Industries. How do you know that?" "Well, if they're describing their teaching machine and the auto tutor and branching type program." And he says, "Want to go to work there?" And I said, "Well, let's find out what they're doing." So he said, "Well, why don't we write them a letter?" And I said, "No, why don't we send them a telegram?" And so what we did is my being basically cheap, we sent them a night letter, which saved us some money, where we sent it to their headquarters, which is in Santa Barbara at the time. And I guess we got some points for figuring out who they were and saying, here's a guy who's into human factors with an interest in marketing. The other one is into the learning technology thing. And damn it, they didn't offer Tom a job. And 3 months later, I joined them. And to my disappointment, they moved their world headquarters from where I wanted to move to, which is Santa Barbara, California, to New York City, which is a place I didn't want to live. And so there I was, working in New York City. And one day I got a call from 2 faculty members, again in a college of education, A.J. Foycross and Irene Cipher, to come down and talk to their course about programmed instruction. They were interested in it. And I went down, and I was talking to, Foy's course for about 20 minutes, and he said, "Stop." And I said, "All right." "Another failure, Roger." And he said, "I'll be right back." And he came back with Irene Cipher's class. And instead of being a 2 or 3 hour course, we went for 5 or 6 hours. And nobody left. It was an evening course. And we had a good time. And the next day I got a call from Professor Cross, who was one of the senior people at New York University. He said, "I see you don't have a doctorate." I said, "No, I never really have picked one up along the way and with family and work." And he said, "Irene and I would like to invite you to finish your doctorate with us. You were the first person who ever came in here and treated our graduate students as if they were graduate students." And I thought, wow, I'll never get an invitation like that. And in fact, until he died, Foy was one of my mentors, and Irene finished the job while I was working full time for Bolt, Beranek and Newman, and traveling all around and consulting and things of that nature. And then I had a memorable weekend one time. That within a period of 5 days, I got my PhD, completed the orals, quit my job at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, and got married. Now that was an action-packed week, and had applications out, all kinds of interest, and then Kennedy got assassinated, and everything stopped. And Bolt, Beranek and Newman, who I'm grateful to this day, said, "Look, we know you quit. We'll keep you on the payroll. We'll find something for you to do until you get the job you really want to." So there's always a soft spot in my heart for BBN, who did the right thing and saved me, because newly divorced, newly married, newly minted, I didn't have any resources. And then I went to work for Douglas Aircraft and in training, human factors and training, and then became assistant to vice president for engineering and research, and then figured that, I've started to develop stuff that I didn't want to be proprietary. So, and Bob Corrigan, who I'd met with the SAFE system, and one of the original thinkers in instructional systems and performance systems, Bob said, let's apply for the Experienced Teacher Fellowship Program. At that time, what's now Chapman University. So we applied for it. Guess what? We got it. And so I became the associate director of that and a professor at Chapman. Cut my salary by about 53% overnight, and started working to prepare teachers with system thinking, system concepts. Gave me a chance to develop needs assessment. Decided that this was very threatening to some of the senior faculty around there. I remember the graduate dean said, well, what would your field be without all this jargon? And I looked at him and I said, probably what chemistry would be without the confusing periodic table. But it was this kind of threat that we got. We're always getting from, trying to develop new paradigms. And at that time, again, it was when Branson was working, Morgan was working, Walt Dick were working. A lot of people, too numerous to mention, who were building this field from nothing. And all of this, there was a wonderful, wonderful ferment that was going on in the United States, especially, a little bit in England. So I decided to move to this new university called the U.S. International University, which had a fantastic faculty. While I was there, we had 7 people who had been, were, or were to be presidents of the American Psychological Association on the faculty. I mean, what a wonderful place to interact with students and people. And wrote my first real book there. Wrote one with Bob Corrigan called Why System Engineering, which is now being used. People are rediscovering that. It was picked up by the commanding general of the Air Force System Command, and he used it as presentation as what is system engineering. And then I wrote Educational System Planning, which is, by the way, still published in Spanish, and I can't get them to update it. It's either the 2nd or 3rd best-selling book in education in Spanish in the world, and what I wrote in 1972. And I'd love to update it, but it's not that it's wrong, it's just I've learned more about it. And then earlier I said the story about coming here. It's a journey of learning and continuous improvement, and I've been blessed with a number of people who've helped me do that.
Now you have your relationship specifically with 2 other faculty members here goes back long, with Morgan and Branson. But tell us about your earliest, how you all got together.
Actually, it was probably through, well, we knew of each other's work. At least I knew of their work, and thought there was some really interesting things that were going on. We had Morgan and Branson. Morgan was heading up a division of Litton Industries in, I think, College Park, Maryland at the time. Bob Corrigan was heading up another division of Litton Industries in Anaheim, California, and I was doing some consulting with Corrigan. We had developed something called Operation PEP, Preparing Educational Planners, where we were training every county superintendent, education superintendent in California in system planning, system thinking. And at the same time, Corrigan was developing his system approach for education, then changed the system approach for effectiveness as he generalized from education to a larger field. And was developing those materials for Litton Industries, which they had acquired. And then we all ended up working on a common project, Oakland Community College in Union Lake, Michigan, where they decided to start a community college which was really performance-based. And they had actually gone out and recruited the best people in the world, except for me, to work on this. Branson and Morgan. Branson was helping them develop the learning systems, and we found out that people from divergent backgrounds brought different things to the table, and we found out that you could design learning opportunities. In fact, one of the interesting things that happened one day is we spent all this time to make it self-instructional, self-paced, that we replaced the teacher, re-place, the teacher from a lecturer to a learning guidance counselor, and mentor. Remember having students come out of this instructionally system design learning opportunities, and the instructor would sit around and say, well, how'd that go? And the students would think, oh, that was great. No, it's not. Come, you and I better talk. They had role robbery, and what they were going to do because of the way in which they knew how to operate. They were basically undermining the whole design, and the whole reason they decided to come to work for this. Everybody was recruited on the basis they wanted to create this new model of learning that was learner-centered, not teacher-centered. And we found out that over time that people were very threatened with this. Another experience I had was doing the strategic planning for the first ever private university in the history of Australia, Bond University, which is in the Gold Coast. And we decided that the president, the vice chancellor, they call him vice chancellors there, Don Watts, was probably the best educational entrepreneur I ever met. Had a personal chair of chemistry at University of Western Australia, took the Western Australian Institute of Technology to be at Curtin University, which is a major accomplishment. He was selected to start Bond University from scratch. We were going to make it performance-oriented. We decided, for instance, as a faculty, a core faculty, that there would be no deans. There would be foundation professors, and we'd have an interdisciplinary. And the other universities got furious over this new model, and they called us all kinds of names reminiscent of when Brandeis University started. Everybody said it was nothing but a diploma mill. Now it's one of the most respected universities in the world. That people get very threatened by new approaches and new paradigms. And so gradually they capitulated and capitulated and capitulated so they would get people into their comfort zones. Fascinating experiment in change. And that's why I'm more interested in change creation than change management. We spend all our time managing the change, it's reactive. If we do change creation, it's going to be proactive. So that's, I guess, the storyline on what I just described is if you're incompetent, keep moving, so I did.
How important is it to have a background in our field today? How important is it to have a background in psychology? And how important, especially if you're going to teach in higher education, how important is it to have a business background or some practical experience?
Well, all of us, we get hired by our disciplines. Psychology, I think, is one of those disciplines that was at the core of where our field came from. Engineering is another basis. Business is another basis. Human resource development is another basis. So any of these areas could get people ready for making an active contribution to learners and to the field. Again, though, this flies in the face of what I think is going to be the next model, and that is not interdisciplinary, but synthesized and integrated. This concept of real world is one that bothers me. We hear this a lot. This is the real world. One of the mythologies is that faculty and universities are not in the real world, and that's nonsense. This is huge, huge business. And we, like anybody else, public or private, are competing for very scarce dollars. So it's just not a matter of anyway just rolling up a wheelbarrow to the legislature and they fill it up and you spend it any way you want to. We're into performance-based budgeting. We're into strategic planning. We're into return on investment. The federal government now has the Government Performance and Results Act, where you have to prove value added for what you get. So I think the old paradigm is that academics are not real world. I think the new paradigm is that we all have something to contribute to that big picture. And again, I think if we start looking at society as the primary client beneficiary instead of disciplines, then these roles will be better defined and we can have contributions from all kinds of different sources. Does that avoid your question too badly?
No. You've mentioned this a number of times, but tell us, what do you mean by strategic planning, and what do you mean by strategic thinking?
strategic planning is to define where you want to head, why you want to go there, and what functions have to be accomplished to get you from where you are to where you want to be. I distinguish between strategic planning, where new goals and objectives can be created and old ones thrown away. I distinguish that from tactical planning, which says, I already know where I'm headed. Now, what are the best ways and means to get me from there, here to there, and choosing them? And then operational planning, which is about, well, how do I keep this thing on track and continuously improve it? We blur those three levels of planning. Most of the stuff out there that's called strategic planning is tactical and operational planning as far as I'm concerned. It misses the drama of being able to re-engineer entire organization or an entire society to make sure that there are means to useful ends. So strategic planning, the primary client and beneficiary is society now and the future. My version of strategic planning is what I call in a couple of books and articles Strategic Planning Plus, or mega planning, where the society now in the future is the primary client beneficiary, and everything is oriented towards that, value added to external clients and society. Strategic thinking is the mindset that we use when we use mega planning. When we look at Strategic Planning Plus, we look at society as the primary client and link everything that we use, do, produce, and deliver to value added for external clients and society. That's strategic thinking. It's how you go about orienting yourself and your organization. The trick to it, I think, again, is mega planning or strategic planning plus, is to realize that every organization, yours and mine, are means to societal ends. If we're not adding value there, we're yesterday's news.
You're considered an expert in the field of needs assessment.
That's scary.
Tell us, for our audience here, what does that mean? Why is needs assessment important?
Oh, that's code for make sure you have a problem before you rush off to solve it. I talked earlier about the importance of this distinguishing between means and ends. First define what and then how. The needs and needs assessments got all mucked up and all muddy. Abe Maslow, who was one of the heroes of our culture and thinking, actually, and I had the privilege of having a short conversation with him before he died. And I said, Abe, you don't have a hierarchy of needs. What do you mean? I said, look, where do we read about you? And he says, well, I hope everybody buys my books. And I said, well, yes, and if they don't, what do we read? Well, the chapter's on motivation. That's right, you have a hierarchy of motivators. Because what you do is you identify when you have gaps in anywhere from survival to self-actualization. This is roughly the order in which you will attend and close those gaps. So you have a hierarchy of motivators. And he looked at me, and Maslow was probably one of the few real humanists who were themselves actually humanistic. He said, Roger, I understand what you're saying, but I have a lot invested in this. But some people, again, confuse means and ends, motivation with the consequences. And so there's a lot in our history that makes us look at needs as means and not ends. Then there's advertising and propaganda. You need this car. You need this toothpaste. The whole idea is to disempower you instead of looking at the gaps between current results and consequences and desired or required results and consequences. They want to shift us right into a solution. Buy this product. Do this thing. And that's disempowering. And so the advertising world wants us to use the word need as a verb, just so long as so they can manipulate us. And so what we're stuck with is a lot of history and a lot of learning and reinforcement about needs as being means and not ends. And so what I'm trying to do is to reinforce the people and to see the advantage of looking at need as a gap between current results and desired results. Nothing more, nothing less. And it has those advantages of the what should be gives you your objectives and design specifications, your evaluation continuous improvement criteria, and a way to justify the means on the basis of the cost to meet the need versus the cost to ignore it. As a former president of Harvard said, if you think education is expensive, put a price tag on ignorance. But again, we are doing type critters. We want to get things done. We want to swing into activity. And so we often are blessed with the opportunity to act in haste and repent in leisure when we find out we've come up with a solution to no known problem. So if a need is a gap in results, then you can define needs at the mega, at the macro, and the micro level. And that way, as you roll down, you get strategic alignment. Look at the data is not very hopeful about doing something called a training needs assessment. Well, training, is it a means or an end? It's a means. In fact, just about any word in the English language that ends in ing is a means. Planning, assessing, training, developing, educating. So if you already know the solution is training, what's a needs assessment supposed to do? It's like a wish list. Tell me what training you need. Well, that's like saying, come sit on Santa's knee and tell him everything you've ever dreamed of. And we'll get whole bunches of solutions and resources and never be able to justify any of the selection of resources on the basis of the cost to meet the need or close the gap in results and the cost to ignore it. In fact, there's a recent paper out, which I think is going to be a classic, by Trenner, Greenberry, and Watkins, called Training Needs Assessment, a conflict in terms. And they point out that if you listen to Deming and Duran, who I think are very credible people, that if you start at the micro level, or the training or solutions level, or individual performance improvement level, that you'll be wrong 80 to 90% of the time. 80 to 90% of the time. That's breathtakingly bad odds. And yet it's comfortable. What training do you need? Need is a verb. Well, why do they say this? Well, if you're listening to Deming and Duran, it's either 80 or 90% of all performance breakdowns are not individual performance breakdowns, but are system breakdowns. So if you fix things down at the micro level, and the problem is still the system, you're going to be wrong. So why do we want to do training needs assessments? Well, it's comfortable, it's conventional, and besides, I don't have to change. I can use need as a verb. So that's why I think it's very, very important to not confuse means and ends, and not to use need as a verb. It might sound like semantic quibbling, but it's no more semantic quibbling than the difference between and physics. So that's why I make such a fuss over it.
You also talk a little bit about quality. What does that mean, so-called performance?
Well, this classical definition is meeting or exceeding customer specifications. And I want to add to that what I call quality management plus, and that is that it's not only does it meet specifications, but it's useful to clients and society. So that's quality management plus. If you do like some of the gurus of quality say, it's not about goodness, it's about meeting specifications. Then you can get ISO 9000 certification or Baldrige Award or for an asbestos insulation factory or a slide wheel factory. It doesn't talk about the usefulness to the external client and society. So quality is both fitness for use as judged by the user and adding value to society and external clients. I think that quality management continuous improvement is probably the most important single driver to our field of performance improvement. That way, in fact, I've stopped using the term evaluation by itself. I blur it with continuous improvement not because evaluation is bad. I mean, comparing your results with your purposes makes sense. But why I like the continuous improvement cast on it is to use data, performance data, for fixing and not for blaming.
Our field right now is, there's a lot of interest in constructivism in the field. How does constructivism fit?
Well, that's an interesting topic. It's one that surfaces about every 35 or 50 years. As David Grunder, a distinguished professor of philosophy, an expert on scientific method here at Florida State University, in an article that he wrote, He points out that every time constructivism under one guise or another has surfaced, it's failed, and then for some reason it comes back again. It's one of those interesting things that constructivism in the center makes sense. What it says is everybody's realities are different, and that we have to understand that as an individual differences. So this is like saying there's individual differences of what people bring to a learning situation because of different learning experience. And that's very sensible. When you get to the extremes, it falls apart. For instance, if your reality is so totally different than my reality, such that I can't set objectives and common purposes, how can you even communicate to me that you do have a reality or it's different? So it's solipsistic. It destroys its own self rationally and logically. I have an associate and friend in New Zealand Hugh Oakley Brown, who is a performance improvement specialist. He does the Megger workshops in Australia and New Zealand, and a very, very accomplished man. And he says, I'm a constructivist. He said, it's wonderful. I have all the authority and none of the responsibility. Because if it doesn't work, they say, well, that's your reality. It's sort of a ludicrous game to play that escapes the drama of defining with others, other partners. Not imposing, but defining with them where you want to head and why you want to head there. And then getting them involved in not only the definition of where to head, but also how best to get there. I think a lot of the arguments for constructivism are not for constructivism. It's attacking behaviorism as if they don't know what behaviorism is. They use it in a pejorative term, and yet everything we do is behavior. I mean, have you done anything today that isn't behavior? Then why not look at that behavior and then later look at performance? I think it's a fad that comes and goes that really allows people to escape the responsibility, the professional responsibility of, with your partners, defining where to head, why you want to go there, and then being responsible together for getting from here to there.
You have talked about the importance, when we talk to discuss things about graduate students, about the importance of being up in the current literature, knowing the people. Who would you say are the brightest thinkers today, the forward-thinking people, and why would you say that?
There's so many. There's so many interesting things being written now. I've always been sorry that Bob Branson has not written any books that are out there. His article on the upper limit theorem is one of the most brilliant things that's available, and yet nobody knows about it. His experience with instructional design and development, I mean, he and Morgan and that team were the architects of what people are doing now and modifying. Bob Morgan's book on the redesign of the educational system in Korea is something everybody ought to read, because this is Bob Morgan's probably the world's leading expert on large system change. And yet these are not in the popular lexicon. They're recognized. People in the field know who these people are. I think Joe Harless has made a huge contribution. He doesn't publish very much, so you either take his workshops or read his couple of books, An Ounce of Prevention's Worth a Pound of Cure, is the Eden Conspiracy, the ABCD system. I think this is important stuff. Gary Rumler and Braish, and their books on organization, where they stop at the macro level, and they're very clear about this. But they talked about the white space in the organization. It's not just these little splinters, but what's going on among those. I think that's worth reading. Bob Megger has probably influenced more people than all of us combined with his objectives, his performance-based emphasis. Now, he stops by and large at the micro level, but he's very clear about that. His first and second books, and now his third edition on setting measurable objectives, is the Bible. And the rest of his series in the six-pack and stuff is very, very important, because it's performance and consequences related. Bob Corrigan's earlier stuff on the system approach for education is very important. Walter Dick's codifying of instructional systems and the changes that have been made over the years, again, focuses on micro-level learner performance. But again, that's what they're intending to do. The list goes on of people. It's interesting how many are at Florida State University. And I think I blame that on Bob Morgan. Bob came here from as a senior educational executive at the then U.S. Office of Education. He was recruited to head up a Department of Education Research. And he went out and he recruited the Bransons, recruited the Gagnes. Walt Dick was already here, but gave Walt an arena and the support to perform. All of this here wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Bob Morgan. Bob's an interesting guy because not only is he confident in himself, but he's unafraid of talent. People who know things different than he does, doesn't threaten him, it interests him. And so he's put together I think a rather interesting team of people. And it shows. He just got the Thomas F. Gilbert Achievement Award this last year. And to show how Florida State University might be on the cutting edge of this field, and I hope we continue it. This has only been given away 9 times in 30 years, and now 3 of the recipients have been or are at Florida State University. Bob Gagne got it, and they made a mistake and gave it to me last year. And so that's some interesting recognition of what Florida State University, and I blame it all on Bob Morgan for starting it.
What are your predictions for the future for our field?
If I knew how to do that, I'd win the lottery. The predictions for the field. I think we're going to put these little spasms of isms to one side. I think we're going to look and see what we can get out of them. The constructivism, for instance, reminds us of individual differences, and people bring different kinds of things to the table, which adult educators have been telling us about for a long time. I think critical theory has done its job by pointing out that sometimes we pick solutions which are destructive to society. But they perhaps go too far by saying everything is corrupt. I mean, we've got to get rid of the isms and the tribalisms in our field. And I think we will. I think we're going to continue to be more holistic. We're going to go from how to what to why, from systems thinking to system thinking. We're going to look at increasingly linking everything to good societal benefit, organizations as means to ends. We're going to link objectives of organizations to that, and then objectives within organizations to that, and we're going to start really getting we're going to get synergistic and integrated, and we're going to start pulling together all these diverse fields to make as the sociologist says, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and I think we'll continue to move in that direction. With a few by-plays and side plays as people get lured into cul-de-sacs, which after all the university ought to be doing. We ought to be open inquiry. Anything should be up on the table for discussion and scientific verification. One of my new realities is that everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own data. So I just see the field the envelopes getting larger and larger, the core pieces of it getting better and better. And I really see a very exciting future for it all.
What would you do differently if you had it all to do?
Oh, that's an interesting statement. I probably would have been less scared of doing the wrong thing early on in life, being concerned about what other people would think rather than what was the productive thing to do. I think I would have spent some more time seeking the knowledge and experience of people internationally. My working, for instance, extensively in Australia and New Zealand and Latin America and Canada, some in Europe, has been a great learning experience. I'm sorry I started doing it so late in my career. So I probably would have gone out seeking more. What other people and other disciplines could offer. I probably, I was going to say I probably would have spent less time in business and industry, but that was really important for me to do because I learned about how organizations can just pursue their own ends, their own objectives, their business purposes, which is so popular now, and be an abject failure because they didn't add value outside of itself to external clients. I guess if I had to do over again, I would have been smarter and faster.
How has your involvement working with other countries, how has it changed your thinking?
It got me to really understand why people should avoid the importation mentality. There's a tendency, for instance, in developing nations saying, oh, they do that in the United States, let's import it. And the truth of the matter is it might not fit. And so I've seen a lot of things happen in countries because they just decided to wholesale import pieces or hunks of our thinking, our systems. What it's shown me is there's some cultural differences. It's also shown me that people have more in common than there are differences. For instance, when you start asking people, what kind of world do you want for tomorrow's child in measurable terms? And you say, the ground rules are this: you can't talk about resources, you can't talk about processes, you can't talk about building block results, you can't even talk about organization results. Describe in measurable terms the world we want to help create for tomorrow's child. And it's fascinating to see how much people agree across cultures. I mean, nobody wants their kids murdered. They don't want their daughters and wives raped. They don't want their families or others dying from infectious diseases. They don't want the people to die from pollution. But these we all have in common. What we fight over are the means. You know, they're still killing each other in the Middle East over how you pray to God, not whether there is a God. So people get their conflict over means and not ends. And if you move the ends up and get them to consider mega-level societal benefits, then people agree on a lot. Now, what they disagree on is favored ways to get there. And this is how we can design performance systems on the basis of what people bring to the situation and what their predilections are and their preferences are. So that's people around the world have educated me about that.
3 books that every graduate student
Well, I wouldn't say need, of course. I should read. Oh, that's a tough one. It's tempting to say, well, just read my recent books, but I won't do that. Interesting. I think, well, one of them has to be a compendium, because I'm going to cheat, because with that, I'd probably read the newest version of the ISPI, Performance System Handbook, that Stolovich and Keeps are now revising. The first one is out, the new one will be out soon. That gives a lot of thinking of a lot of people. Either that or my recent co-edited guidebook for human and organizational improvement. Not because it's good, because it has a lot of the pieces that people have to consider. I wouldn't want them to read Megger's Six-Pack, and simply because it is so clear and it is so concise. If they're not going to do that, I would want them to read Walt Dick's book. But then I wouldn't want them to miss Keller's ABCD model. And again, I'm sorry he hasn't written a book with this in it. Of my stuff, I think probably the best is the Revised Strategic Thinking book. That's an interesting question. Can I ponder that for another 10 years and come back and tell you? There's some wonderful stuff. There's also some garbage out there. There's some really handy-dandy how to do it incomplete guidebooks that makes everybody warm and comfortable. it reminds me of, I think it was Mencken who said, for every one problem, there is one solution, which is simple, straightforward, understandable, and acceptable to everybody, and wrong. And so I would like people to focus on the positive, on creating the world of tomorrow, not how to make today's world more efficient.
Dr. Kaufman, thank you so much for your time, for this
Well,
session. I think people are going to just be delighted, and they're going to learn quite a bit.
well, and I want to thank anybody who's had the courage to get all the way through this thing, and thank you for letting me invade their life space and maybe give them some things to think about. Thank you for including me.